Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Today I would like to conduct an analysis of Ron Paul's recently released plan to restore America. This is his plan to curtail excessive U.S. federal government spending and attempt to reform the budgetary mess that we are in right now. It is the most ambitious budgetary plan of all the Republican candidates in terms of how much it actually cuts, and furthermore, there are many appealing elements in this plan that, if implemented, could change the course that the U.S. federal government has taken throughout much of U.S. history. Namely, this plan, if implemented, would be the beginning of a reversal in direction. Some of the highlights of this plan, before we delve into the specifics, it cuts $1 trillion of spending during just the first year of Ron Paul's presidency, and it would eliminate 5 departments: the departments of energy, housing and urban development, commerce, interior, and education, and it would abolish the atrocious Transportation Security Administration, the TSA. That is the agency that gropes and virtually strip searches people, including young children and the elderly and cancer survivors at airports. And furthermore, it will in many ways reform the way the U.S. federal government conducts itself. It will abolish corporate subsidies. It will abolish aid to foreign regimes. It will end the disastrous U.S. occupations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and many, many other countries throughout the world, which has been quite wasteful and inefficient in many respects. And at the same time, it will follow an incremental approach to reform to make sure that innocent people are not hurt. Ron Paul is not going to cut all federal spending immediately. There are certain programs where the U.S. federal government's obligations have already been established. Some programs he will not cut at all. For instance, benefits to veterans. These are people who essentially have put their lives on the line to advance the interests of the U.S. federal government. And I agree, the least the U.S. federal government can do is give these individuals some assurances of comfort now that they are out of harm's way. For other programs like Social Security and Medicare, there will be incremental reforms. Younger people will be able to opt out of Social Security, and Medicaid will be delegated more to the states so that the states get a certain block grant of federal money, but they have more flexibility with regard to how to implement it so that there's not a one-size-fits-all system anymore. There could actually be some competition among 50 different jurisdictions to see what works better. There will be reductions in government waste, a 10% reduction in the federal workforce, and cuts to excessive federal travel. There will be lowering of some taxes, including the corporate tax rate to 15%. The Bush-era tax cuts will be extended. And furthermore, certain notorious taxes like the gift tax and estate tax will be abolished. Many of the major expansions of federal government power with their myriad unintended consequences will be repealed. That includes the Sarbanes-Oxley Bill of 2002, as well as the misnamed Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act of 2010 and the Dodd-Frank Bill later on that same year. That is the bill that, as one of its unintended consequences, has had the imposition of new debit card fees by entities like Bank of America because it cut off one of their revenue sources with regard to the interchange fees that were charged to merchants for debit cards. So to make that up, they have started charging consumers for the use of those consumers' own funds. I think a lot of consumers would actually benefit from the repeal of these pieces of legislation. With regard to monetary policy, of course, one major plank of the Ron Paul campaign has been to audit the Fed, and indeed the Federal Reserve would be audited under this plan, and Ron Paul would go further and take a step that is quite unprecedented in U.S. history, the legalization of competing currencies, so that individuals may have more recourse against inflation if the dollar continues to deteriorate. So with this overview, I will now go into some of the numbers, and all of this is provided by the Ron Paul campaign itself. And for me, as an independent observer, certainly someone who is partial to Ron Paul, but someone who has had no hand in developing this plan, it's quite interesting to delve in depth and look at the mechanics of what it would actually do. I study tables with numbers in them for a living, so this kind of analysis is not new to me. Nonetheless, one of the benefits that I hope my audience will derive from this presentation is a more fluent understanding of the specifics of this plan. So one interesting aspect here is that all the figures that are presented are in the millions of dollars. That is quite startling if you think of it. So this 501,000 figure is actually $501 billion. And this is what the Department of Defense's spending would be in 2013 after Ron Paul cuts it. After Ron Paul implements this 15% total reduction and ends all of the funding of the US's wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, for example. What could you do with $501 billion? Surely the Department of Defense will not be starved for funds under this plan. As you can see, there will be plenty of funding for any actual defense, any actually worthwhile activities that the Department of Defense might be engaged in. At the same time, a lot of horrendous waste, both in terms of money and lives, will end. One general aspect to keep in mind regarding all of these figures is that even the 2013 figures are after Ron Paul has implemented his proposed cuts. So while in some of these rows you may see growth from 2013 to 2016, keep in mind that there's a dramatic decline before then from the hypothetical 2012 levels, which would be much higher than even the 2016 figures in many of the categories under Ron Paul's plan. This kind of growth from 501 billion to 508 billion can be explained by a variety of factors. One of them is simply inflation, or certain predictable growth in the salaries of the same staff. Indeed, in the federal budget, what often happens is so-called baseline budgeting. These kinds of routine increases into subsequent years are already assumed to be taking effect. And this baseline, this gradually growing spending amount, is what is considered a steady state budget. Reductions from that baseline are considered cuts, and increases from it are considered spending increases. One might dispute that methodology, but if you take a look at these numbers, this is actually less of an increase than a typical baseline increase would be. For veterans' benefits, you see a similar kind of pattern, and this is at the current levels. So what Ron Paul is saying is he will not cut any veterans' benefits. The benefits are projected to continue increasing as they would be in the status quo. He doesn't want to reduce any of the federal government's obligations to veterans. For the Department of Transportation, there are going to be some savings with the privatization of the Federal Aviation Administration and changes in the funding of highways and other means of transit. The Department of Health and Human Services will receive a spending freeze, and this is an absolute freeze, as you can see across all 4 years. It's going to be the same amount spent. The Department of Justice will have a spending freeze, as will the Department of Agriculture. And furthermore, something that I would strongly support is a spending freeze on the Department of Homeland Security. The gargantuan, utterly inept bureaucracy that has really done a miserable job catching actual terrorists, but has made airline travel and even everyday life quite annoying to millions of Americans at the very least, and outright threatening at worst. The Department of State gets a spending freeze in absolute terms as well, and Ron Paul, I think, here is going to fulfill his promise to eliminate a lot of the excessive travel, for instance, to international organizations and conferences and participation in international commissions and international drug programs, which claim many innocent civilian lives abroad, including in Mexico, with the horrendously violent drug wars that are taking place there, and in South America, where they've been taking place for decades. The Environmental Protection Agency is actually going to get a cut, a 30% total reduction from fiscal year 2006 levels, which is an even more substantial reduction from where it is funded at today. And after that cut, there's going to be a freeze on all increases. And furthermore, the US is going to curtail its nation-building activities by eliminating the Iraq Reconstruction Fund. Other discretionary spending here is also projected to actually decline from 2013 to 2016. In this block of figures, what you see is a transfer from mandatory spending to discretionary spending. The difference is mandatory spending encompasses those obligations that the federal government has already incurred. Promises to pay benefits to retirees or to the elderly who require health care. And those benefits cannot be easily rescinded. Indeed, one could make a very legitimate argument that it wouldn't be fair to rescind those benefits because those people were led to rely on them without really having been consulted or having given their consent. And if the federal government now takes away even that after having led them to rely on it, then that would be dubious indeed and a further violation of their rights. So what is happening here is, because of the funding change of these programs from being federally managed to being used as block grants to the states, there is going to be a transfer to discretionary spending, and all of these grants are going to stay the same from 2013 to 2016, so there is not going to be an increase in spending from any of these programs. Next we go on to mandatory spending, and here there's really a lot less that Ron Paul can do because these obligations have already been incurred. The promises have already been made. And as you can see in the rate of growth that we have here, compared to, say, the rate of growth that Ron Paul's budget would institute for the Department of Defense, it is a much higher rate of growth. The magnitude of these figures is only slightly higher than for the Department of Defense figures on the second page, but as you can see here, there's an increase in $32 billion. During that same time period, the Department of Defense budget would only increase by $7 billion. That's more than a fourfold difference in terms of the rate of growth of mandatory spending versus discretionary spending. So you can see here where Ron Paul has control, he is really tightening the fiscal policy of the US federal government. Overall, these growth figures are unfortunate but unavoidable. And there is some reduction here in terms of unemployment compensation. This is probably not something that Ron Paul would do as a matter of policy, but rather because of his plan, the economic situation will improve sufficiently that fewer people are unemployed, so the US federal government doesn't have to pay as many benefits over here. And there are other miscellaneous savings accomplished by, again, reducing federal travel, banning unionized, more expensive projects at the federal level, selling federal lands, particularly as you can see here in 2015, and reforming various payment errors in federal programs. What's very interesting about this row of figures here is that this is one of the most substantial chunks of this entire miscellaneous savings category. You could save more than 40% of the total savings in this category in 2013 by eliminating erroneous payments in federal programs. What does that tell you about how the federal government is managed today? Now on to revenues and how Ron Paul would alter and in many respects reduce the revenue intake of the federal government. As you can see here, there's some baseline budgeting being done in terms of how much is expected to be taken in given the tax policies then in effect. And the footnote says that this baseline revenue intake already takes into account some of the recommendations that Ron Paul described earlier on, like the repeal of various large federal bills, such as the Sarbanes-Oxley law, and the reduction in federal regulations, the repatriation of U.S. companies. What we see here are some of the more explicit effects of each of these measures. In the summary table, describing revenues versus outlays, we can see in part the problem that Ron Paul is trying to struggle against. The federal government's fiscal situation is so bad that even if you implement cuts that are considered quite dramatic by most mainstream political observers, there's still going to be a deficit at the beginning of this plan. If you look here at deficit or surplus, where the negative figures are deficits, for 2013, the total outlays exceed the total revenues by $313.7 billion. The deficit is reduced almost by half in 2014, so it's now just $194 billion. And finally, in 2015 and 2016, under Ron Paul's plan, the US federal government would start running a small surplus. However, take a look at this row here, debt held by the public. It continues to grow at a decreasing rate, but to grow nonetheless for all these 4 years, even while the surplus is being run. Why does this happen? Because the total debt obligation is still going to increase because of the accumulation of interest on already existing debt. So even running this small surplus is only going to come close, but not quite there in terms of stabilizing the total debt. And in order to actually reduce that debt, this trajectory is going to have to continue for many, many more years. There's not going to be an overnight solution, even with Ron Paul's plan. That is how deep a mess has been created by the last decade of rampant deficit spending. One positive aspect, though, is if gross domestic product continues to increase, and granted this is a very imperfect, aggregated measure of economic output, there are many problems with it. If you want to know a bit about this, I suggest that you study the writings of Austrian economists on this subject. But if we consider gross domestic product and its projected growth in these calculations, then we can see some improvement in percentage terms. Both mandatory and discretionary spending is actually going to be lower at the end of these 4 years than it would be at the beginning. Total outlays in the US federal budget are going to decrease from 17.24% of GDP to 15.5% of GDP, while total revenue increases from 15.3% of GDP to 15.59% of GDP. If GDP continues to grow, these numbers are also going to improve in terms of declining shares in both federal spending and federal revenue. As a result, the federal government will constitute less and less as a proportion of the economy. At the same time, one would hope that the revenues exceed the outlays in many of the subsequent years so that this crushing national debt can be reduced. One important metric is the ratio of debt to GDP. Having a debt to GDP ratio in excess even of 60% is quite alarming, and indeed suggests that a country is on the trajectory to default. So if Ron Paul gets his way and implements all of these very ambitious cuts, the ratio of national debt to GDP will be at 92.47%. This is how terrible the situation has been made by the Bush administration and the Obama administration. So the U.S. federal budget has to recover from that. And as you can see over these 4 years, there's a recovery by a little more than 8%. There would still be a long way to go after this. This page is interesting because it provides budget comparisons between Obama's budget, the baseline budget. That's the budget that would exist if everything in the status quo were just to continue as currently planned, including all of the projected spending increases, and Ron Paul's budget during the first term of his presidency. As you can see, the deficits under both Obama's budget and the baseline are colossal compared to what Ron Paul is proposing. Ron Paul's deficit for 2013 would be less than half of Obama's deficit and about 60% of the baseline deficit. Likewise, the deficit in 2014 would be less than a third of Obama's deficit and roughly 2/3 of the baseline deficit. In 2015 and 2016, Ron Paul's budget is the only one by a long shot that would have a surplus. If we compare the figures more directly, as we can see here, Obama's budget has, over those 4 years, more than $2.1 trillion in terms of just deficits, additions to the national debt, as compared to Ron Paul's budget. The baseline budget is a bit more favorable than Obama's budget, but still, it adds $783 billion more dollars to the national debt than Ron Paul's budget does. These figures are comparisons of agency budgets, and this is really where the figures get interesting because you can see just how much Ron Paul is actually cutting. If the Department of Defense weren't cut to $501 billion in 2013, then it would actually be spending almost $700 billion in that year, according to just the baseline, which, with anyone else in office, would likely be increased from that amount as well. And by 2016, the Defense Department would be spending almost $750 billion. Compare that to the much more modest increases that Ron Paul is proposing, and you can see that these are actually cuts from the baseline each year. They're cuts in the rate of growth. The Department of Transportation's budget is a little less than half of the current baseline trajectory. You can see it very clearly for 2016. The baseline is a little more than $80 billion, and Ron Paul's proposal is $39.5 billion. The Department of Health and Human Services is a sizable cut, savings ranging from $14.8 billion to $17.25 billion, quite considerable. The Department of Justice has some cuts in the $7 to $8 billion range. The Department of Agriculture has substantial cuts, about half of the baseline trajectory would be cut under Ron Paul's plan. For the Department of Homeland Security, about a quarter would be cut. For the Department of State, much of it would be cut. About 3/4 would be cut. For the EPA, a little less than half would be cut. For international assistance programs, and that includes money for corrupt sub-Saharan dictators to place in their Swiss bank accounts, everything is cut. For the Department of Energy, Housing and Urban Development, Department of Commerce, Department of the Interior, Department of Education, everything is cut. For Medicaid, the block grants take effect, and the block grants are going to be capable of fulfilling many of the same obligations to beneficiaries with more flexibility. So as a result, at the start, about a third of the funding is going to be cut. Toward the end of it, more than half is going to be cut, because the baseline growth trajectory for Medicaid is quite steep. And as you can recall, This particular item was transferred in Ron Paul's budget from the mandatory category to the discretionary category. With the mandatory category, we've seen that there's not much Ron Paul can really do to curtail this steep trajectory. By transferring it to discretionary funding, he can stabilize it, not just in relative terms, but in absolute terms as well. This is the Children's Health Insurance Program. As you can see, the savings are approaching half, and they're at half because of the block grants by 2015 and 2016. Likewise with food stamps, great savings. More than half of the projected expenditures would be cut. With the child nutrition program, a third would be cut, and that's just at the very beginning. It grows to more than a third later on. This is interesting just as a historical comparison. What happened to get the US federal government into the deep hole that it is in now? As you can see, the last year of surpluses was in 2001. That's before the various disastrous measures, both foreign and domestic, undertaken by the Bush administration, which includes the enormously costly wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as the tremendous increase in federal domestic spending over the first decade of the 21st century. But what we see to be the biggest problems here would be the spending post-financial crisis. In 2008, the deficit was unprecedented for that time, $459 billion. But here is what Obama has done since then and proposes to do in 2012. That's after he has been compelled to make numerous concessions to the self-styled budget hawks in Congress. $1.4 trillion deficit in 2009, almost a $1.3 trillion deficit in 2010, almost a $1.3 trillion deficit in 2011. That's an estimate as of August of this year. And as you can see, Ron Paul has a big, big hole to dig the US government out of. This $314 billion deficit would have been par for the course during the Bush era. It was considered outrageous back then by many Democratic legislators who, when they attained majority power, spent like this. This $194 billion deficit planned for 2014 is still greater than Bush's first-year deficit was. This is how gargantuan the growth in the scope and power of the federal government has been since then, that even Ron Paul can't avoid running greater deficits than George W. Bush did during 2002. And then we get these small surpluses, which are still less, considerably less, than the $128 billion surplus in 2001. So for the situation to really improve, it would take a long time, even under this plan. But this is the least that can be done in order to turn the situation around. If this is not done, then we're going to see more of this. That would be really scary. These are some nice illustrations of the depth of the cuts. A little bit incomplete. And this is one criticism I would have of these graphs, irrespective of who created them. The axis does not begin at 0. When the axis does not begin at 0, the relative magnitudes within the graph are made to seem greater than they actually are. So this graph is structured to look like, oh, Ron Paul is cutting most of it. Well, he's not. He's cutting the level of spending, the total discretionary outlays, from about $1.325 trillion to about $1.075 trillion. Now, that is still something. That is $250 billion. However, I would have liked to see these 1,000 units expanded here on this axis. Still, we can compare in relative terms what this budget is going to do compared to the baseline. As you can see, it grows after the major cut has been implemented at a less rapid rate than the baseline does, especially in subsequent years. The baseline seems to assume a more exponential trajectory, whereas Ron Paul assumes a very gentle linear trajectory. For mandatory outlays, again, there's less that Ron Paul can do, but the trajectory of growth is reduced. It's reduced through the block grants to the states for food stamps, Medicaid, the Children's Health Insurance Program, and other programs. And for total outlays, this is a combination of the discretionary graph and the mandatory graph that we saw previously. Now, here's an interesting comparison. This is a graph around the historical average spending as a percentage of GDP. In recent years, US federal spending has been considerably higher than the historical average, and it would continue to be considerably higher under the baseline. It would at first approach the historical average, but then depart from it once again as the mandatory spending spirals out of control once again. The Ron Paul budget would actually not just reach the historical average very early on with the initial cuts, but continue to decline below it, almost approaching 15% by 2015 and 2016. And that's, of course, assuming that the economy grows as a result of these liberalizing measures that give individuals more freedom, that give businesses more opportunities to innovate and institute more regime certainty so that businesses can plan for the long term without fearing that the next major 2,000-page bill is going to turn all of their careful planning to naught. With regard to revenue, as we can see, under all three budgets, revenue is going to increase eventually past 2012 levels. However, there will be initial cuts in taxes, and these tax cuts, in terms of the kinds of taxes that are levied and the percentages, are going to continue to be in force. This increase in revenue is just because the economy is going to be larger, so at the same tax rates, the absolute dollar amounts paid to the federal government will be greater. And in terms of deficits, this is just a nice bar graph to show Ron Paul's trajectory versus all of the others. Essentially, the baseline is close to half, sometimes a little less than half, of the deficits of Obama's budget, and Ron Paul is the only one that accomplishes these small surpluses. Publicly held debt. This is the pie that needs to be diminished if the United States federal government is to avoid default, and if we are to avoid many, many decades of paying interest on this debt. The Ron Paul budget would immediately eliminate this chunk because this is the debt that the Federal Reserve owns. The Federal Reserve is an agency of the US federal government for all practical purposes. Some people say, well, no, it's a private banking cartel, but it was established by an act of Congress and it performs a governmental function, the function of regulating the money supply. So it's debt that the US federal government owns to itself, and in reducing this, that's $1.7 trillion, this reduces the interest obligations on the US federal debt, which is going to save taxpayers some money. This is a nice illustration of defense spending and what it's going to be like under Ron Paul versus the planned Obama budget. As you can see, this president, Barack Obama, did not deserve to earn a Nobel Peace Prize. His military spending is historically unprecedented. Again, the axes are a little bit misleading because they should be down here at 0. However, if you compare the 2001 spending that characterized the first year of the Bush administration to the 2011 spending, that's our present year, Barack Obama has increased that to $750 billion. That is about 2.5 times more than what George W. Bush started with during his first term. Some Nobel Peace Prize laureate. Well, that is the entirety of the officially released Ron Paul budget plan. I think examining it really ought to give some perspective as to the magnitude of the problem that is being faced. This problem is such that even Ron Paul himself can only chisel away a little bit at it after many years of diligent effort. Why not give him a chance?